The wedding was perfect. Every detail, every flower, every shimmering light had been carefully planned for months. The venue was breathtaking, a grand hall filled with hundreds of well-dressed guests, each one whispering about the union of two of the most powerful families in the city. The groom, a billionaire CEO, known for his sharp business instincts and undeniable charm, stood at the altar, composed and confident. The bride, elegant and radiant, walked down the aisle in a gown that seemed to glow under the chandeliers. Everything was going exactly as planned, until the doors at the back of the hall burst open. Gasps rippled through the crowd as all heads turned. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, stood in the doorway. Her small hands gripped the edge of her dress, her big eyes scanning the room. Her presence was jarring, not just because she had interrupted the ceremony, but because she didn't belong there. No one knew her. No one expected her. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, her tiny shoes tapping against the marble floor. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Who was she? Where were her parents? How had she even gotten in? The officiant hesitated, glancing at the groom, waiting for him to decide what to do. But the groom wasn't looking at the officiant. He wasn't even looking at his bride. His eyes were locked onto the little girl, his face pale, as if he had just seen a ghost. The girl finally stopped, a few feet from the altar. She tilted her head slightly, then took a deep breath before saying the words that sent a shockwave through the entire room. "Why are you marrying her? You're my daddy." Silence. Thick. Heavy. The bride's expression froze. The guests sat in stunned disbelief. And the groom, he didn't move. For the first time in his life, the man who had built an empire, the man who always had the right words, was speechless. The little girl's lip trembled. "You promised you'd come back." A sharp gasp came from the bride's side of the aisle, followed by frantic whispers. Some guests turned to each other, exchanging wide-eyed looks. Others pulled out their phones, ready to capture the scandal unfolding in real time. The groom took an unsteady step forward. "Who told you that?" His voice, usually firm and controlled, wavered slightly. The girl's small hands curled into fists. "Mommy." The bride's grip on her bouquet tightened, her knuckles turning white. "What is she talking about?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. The little girl turned to her, blinking up with innocent yet piercing eyes. "He said he loved us." The weight of her words sent a cold shiver through the room. The groom swallowed hard, his mind racing. The guests leaned in, hanging on to every second of the unfolding drama. The whispers grew louder. Speculation spread like wildfire. A secret child? A hidden past? The perfect wedding had just become the most shocking event of the year. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't get any worse, the little girl pulled something from the pocket of her dress, a small crumpled photograph. She held it up with trembling fingers. "You gave me this," she whispered. "You said, 'Family is forever.'" The groom's face drained of all color. The bride's eyes burned with betrayal. The room erupted into chaos. The room was in utter chaos. The whispers had turned into hushed arguments, guests glancing at each other in disbelief. The bride stood frozen, her expression unreadable, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. The groom, a man always in control, seemed to struggle to find words. His gaze remained locked on the little girl, the small crumpled photograph in her hand, making his throat tighten. Someone in the crowd gasped. Others pulled out their phones, capturing the unfolding scandal. The wedding that was meant to be the talk of the city for its grandeur was now making headlines for an entirely different reason. The little girl's bottom lip trembled, but she stood her ground. "You said you'd come back," she repeated, her voice softer now, almost pleading. The groom took a slow, unsteady step toward her. His hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing for an explanation. But there was no quick way out of this. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where's your mother?" The question sent another ripple through the room. The little girl hesitated, her tiny fingers gripping the photograph tighter. "She told me to find you." Her voice wavered, but there was something determined in her eyes. "She said you'd know what to do." The bride turned, her composure slipping. "Who is she talking about?" Her voice was sharp, demanding, but there was an undeniable edge of hurt beneath it. The groom didn't answer immediately. His mind was too busy trying to piece together how this was even possible. He had built his entire life on control, on carefully crafted plans. And now, in a single moment, everything had unraveled. He took another step forward, lowering himself to the little girl's level. His voice, though quieter, carried weight. "What's your name?" She blinked up at him. "You don't remember?" There was something heartbreaking about the way she asked it. His throat tightened. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The bride let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "Enough!" Her voice cut through the thick air. "Who is she?" The groom finally stood up, facing the woman he was supposed to marry. The weight of all the eyes on him felt suffocating, but none of it compared to the unspoken accusation in the bride's gaze. Before he could speak, the little girl whispered something that made the entire room fall silent again. "Mommy said you forgot us." The words hit like a punch. The guests shifted, the tension rising once more. The bride let out a bitter laugh, stepping back. "Oh, this is unbelievable." The little girl didn't take her eyes off the groom. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice soft. For the first time in his life, he had no answer. The silence was unbearable. The weight of every unspoken word filled the air, pressing down on the groom like an iron grip around his throat. He could feel the bride's gaze burning into him, demanding answers, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the little girl. Her small fingers still clutched the photograph, as if it was the only proof she had of what she was saying. The bride took a sharp breath, her voice laced with cold disbelief. "Are you going to say something, or should I assume the worst?" The little girl shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Her big eyes, filled with something between hope and fear, landed back on the groom. "You don't remember me?" Her voice was small, but the hurt in it was unmistakable. His jaw tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. How could they? How was this even possible? The guests murmured among themselves, some leaning in to whisper theories, while others simply gawped at the scene unfolding in front of them. The perfect wedding had turned into a scandal before the vows could even be spoken. The bride finally turned to the little girl, her voice more measured but still sharp. "Who is your mother?" The girl hesitated. She pressed the photograph against her chest, as if it was suddenly too personal to show. Then, almost reluctantly, she whispered a name. The groom's entire body went rigid. The name was like a ghost from his past, a memory buried so deep, he almost convinced himself it had never been real. But now, standing before him, was living proof that it had been. The bride caught the change in his expression immediately. Her lips parted slightly, then pressed into a thin line. "So you do know her?" The little girl's voice cut through the tension again. "She said you used to love her." A few gasps came from the crowd, followed by hushed whispers. Some of the guests were already texting furiously, no doubt spreading the story beyond these walls. The groom forced himself to take a steady breath. His mind raced, searching for explanations, but deep down, a sickening feeling told him this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a joke. The bride straightened her shoulders. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice lower now, but no less dangerous. He hesitated. Lying wouldn't help him now. Not when the truth was standing right in front of him. Before he could respond, the little girl spoke again, quieter this time. "Mommy said if you didn't come back, I should find you myself." The words sent a fresh wave of shock through him. The bride's grip on her bouquet tightened so much that the delicate petals began to crumble in her hands. "She told her to come here." The girl nodded. "She said it was time." The groom finally found his voice, though it was hoarse. Time for what? The girl's fingers trembled as she unfolded the photograph. This time, she turned it so he could see. His breath caught. It wasn't just a picture of him. It was a picture of him holding a baby. A baby with the same big, familiar eyes staring back at him now. His head spun. He had no memory of this moment. But there it was, captured in ink, undeniable. The bride's face paled. "Oh my God," she whispered. The guests erupted in a frenzy of speculation. And in that moment, the groom realized that nothing about his life would ever be the same again. The groom's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the photograph. It was impossible. And yet, the proof was right in front of him, an image he didn't remember taking, holding a child he hadn't known existed. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. The bride exhaled sharply. "Say something." Her voice was raw, teetering between fury and something dangerously close to heartbreak. "Is this real?" The little girl's hands trembled as she clutched the photograph. Her big eyes flickered with something fragile hope mixed with fear. "Mommy said you loved me." The weight of her words crushed him. He forced himself to meet her gaze, but the depth of emotion there made it impossible to speak. His entire world was shifting beneath his feet. The bride let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You're joking, right?" She turned to the guests, as if searching for someone to confirm that this was some kind of cruel prank. But all she found were wide-eyed stares and whispers growing louder by the second. One of the guests murmured, "This is unreal." Another whispered, "Did he really?" The sound of murmuring grew into a restless buzz, the tension thick enough to choke the air. The groom finally swallowed hard, his voice strained. "I don't know how this happened." The bride's expression twisted with disbelief. "You don't know?" She let out a breathless laugh. "You expect me to believe you just forgot?" The little girl flinched at the sharpness in her voice. She looked at the groom, as if waiting for him to deny it. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, a deep, uneasy feeling settled in his chest. Something about all of this felt wrong, not just the situation itself, but the way it had unfolded. A memory just doesn't disappear. And yet, he couldn't recall any of it. Not the photo, not the baby, not the woman whose name had sent a shockwave through his entire body. The bride turned to the little girl, her voice softer now, but still laced with urgency. "Where is your mother?" The girl hesitated, lowering her gaze. She couldn't come. The groom's brows furrowed. "Why not?" She bit her lip. Her small hands fidgeted with the fabric of her dress. "She's gone?" A hush fell over the room. The bride's expression flickered. "Gone where?" The girl's voice was barely above a whisper. "She said if something happened to her, I should find you." The groom's chest tightened. A cold dread crawled up his spine. He suddenly felt like the ground beneath him had given way entirely. The bride looked at him with an unreadable expression. "Something happened to her." The little girl nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. The groom took a slow, measured breath, his mind racing. This wasn't just a mistake from his past coming to light. This was something deeper, something bigger. And he had a sinking feeling that whatever had happened to the girl's mother, it wasn't an accident. For the first time, fear crept into his veins. Because if she was gone, that meant someone had wanted her gone. And now, they might be coming for the little girl too. The air in the room had changed. The weight of the little girl's words settled over everyone, thick with unease. The murmurs had faded into stunned silence. No one knew what to say. No one knew what to do. The bride stood motionless, her bouquet hanging loosely in her fingers, forgotten. The groom, for the first time in his life, felt truly powerless. He knelt down slowly, lowering himself to the little girl's level. "What do you mean something happened to her?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency he couldn't hide. The girl blinked rapidly, as if trying to fight back tears. She said if she ever had to leave. I should come find you." Her small hands gripped the hem of her dress, and then she was gone. He tightened his jaw. "She stays with me." A flicker of irritation crossed the man's face. "That's not a good idea." The guests had started to back away, sensing something dangerous unfolding. The bride looked between them, her expression shifting from confusion to realization. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. The man ignored her. His gaze stayed locked on the groom. "You don't understand what you're involved in. Then why don't you explain it?" A slow, humorless smile. "It's better if you don't know." Something inside him snapped. He had spent his life making the right decisions, choosing logic over emotion. But right now, none of that mattered. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the little girl gripping his arm, terrified. It was about the woman who had once loved him enough to trust him with the one thing that mattered most. It was about the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how dangerous. He took a step forward, his voice steel. "She stays with me." The man's smile faltered. And that's when the sirens outside shattered the silence. The tension in the air exploded. The man turned sharply, eyes narrowing. But it was too late. Security had already flooded in, guests scrambling to the sides. Someone had called for help. The little girl buried her face against his side. "Mommy said you'd keep me safe." His throat tightened. He wasn't going to let her down. Not now. Not ever. The sirens outside grew louder, flashing red and blue lights, cutting through the tension in the room. The groom stood firm, shielding the little girl from the man in the suit, whose calm demeanor had started to crack. Security rushed in, pushing through the stunned crowd. The guests, once captivated by the wedding, were now witnesses to something far more unpredictable. The man in the suit barely flinched as two officers approached. Instead, he lifted his hands slightly, a subtle gesture of surrender. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice low, controlled. One of the officers stepped forward. "Sir, we've been given a tip about a potential threat at this wedding." His sharp gaze moved between the groom and the suited man. "And from what I'm seeing, it looks like someone doesn't belong here." The groom's pulse pounded. He didn't know who had made the call, but for the first time since this nightmare started, he felt the weight begin to shift. The suited man smirked. "You think you've won?" His gaze flickered toward the little girl. "This isn't over." Something inside the groom snapped. He took a step forward, his voice cold. "She's not going anywhere with you." The officer nodded toward security. "Escort him out. We'll handle the rest." The tension in the room finally cracked as two guards grabbed the suited man's arms, leading him toward the exit. He didn't struggle. He didn't protest. But the look in his eyes sent a chill down the groom's spine. Just before he disappeared through the doors, the man spoke one last time. "You still don't know the full story." Then, he was gone. The weight of the moment crashed over the groom. He exhaled slowly, then turned to the little girl. She was still clutching his sleeve, her eyes filled with both fear and something else, trust. He knelt down in front of her, his voice softer now. "You're safe." She swallowed hard. For now, the words shouldn't have come from a child. She had been forced to carry a burden far too heavy for someone her age. And in that moment, he knew whatever had happened to her mother, whatever danger still lurked in the shadows, he would get to the bottom of it. The bride, who had been silent through most of the chaos, finally spoke. "What are you going to do now?" Her voice was even, but there was something fragile beneath it. The groom stood up slowly, still holding the girl's hand. "Find out the truth." The bride nodded, but something in her expression shifted. This day had started as the beginning of a new life for both of them. Now it had become something unrecognizable. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "And us?" He met her gaze. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, but none of them would be enough. She sighed, forcing a small, sad smile. "I already know." The wedding was over before it had truly begun. As the guests murmured, as security worked to clear the chaos, the groom led the little girl away from the altar. The questions swirled in his mind, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.